Well met, travelers. Thanks for stopping by. In this video, I explore the religious themes built into the Rings of Power's narrative structure, including its incorporation of the concept of objective morality, the ambience it builds around the idea of Providence acting in the world, and the ways that its four protagonists, Arondir, Elrond, Galadriel, and Nori, act as agents of divine providence by holding fast to some of the traditional Christian virtues. Oh, and also, Halbrand is the Antichrist. So, I had this friend back in the aughts. We'll call him Nigel. And Nigel did not like The Lord of the Rings. Now, I know, nobody's perfect. He was a great guy otherwise, but on this, sadly, he had fallen to the shadow. Anyway, Nigel never read the books. He only ever saw the Peter Jackson movie trilogy once. He saw them in the theater with me and a group of our mutual friends, and after not really liking the Fellowship of the Ring all that much, I know, he tagged along with us to the other movies' theatrical releases, mostly to be supportive. Like I said, he was a solid dude, and his overall assessment of the movies at the time was that they were okay, but a lot of things just seemed too forced or too convenient for him. It was too convenient for Nigel that Gandalf arrived with the Rohirrim at Helm's Deep at exactly the right moment. It was too forced that Arwen escaped the Ringwraiths with Frodo on horseback, even though, in Nigel's estimation, they had clearly been close enough to grab her. These things, and his other little nitpicks throughout the movies, Nigel could probably have overlooked, though. The deal-breaker for him was the climax of The Return of the King, where neither Frodo nor Sam prevailed. Instead, the One Ring got destroyed because Gollum, of all frickin' people, tripped and fell over the edge into the lava? Nigel actually turned to me in the theater and said, "Come on, what the F was that?" Hey folks, quick note from future editing Bob here, who is hosting this month's episode of Memory is Fallible. I just realized I made kind of a big mistake in the script I was reading and writing here. You see, I really did have a friend back in the aughts whose name really was not Nigel, and he really did dislike the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies, and particularly the climax of Return of the King. He felt that the climax of Return of the King was too deus ex machina thanks to the timing of the battle being led by Aragorn and the plot beats being achieved by Frodo, Sam, and Gollum as they wrestle for control of the One Ring, and the way Frodo and Gollum both fall over the cliff but only Gollum dies, and so forth. That's all true. But I realized while editing this video that when writing the script, my brain had transposed the ending of the book version of Return of the King into my memory of the movie version of Return of the King. You see, while I wrote this script, I genuinely thought that I saw a movie and that my friend saw a movie in which Gollum and Frodo did not wrestle and Gollum simply fell over the cliff by himself as he does in the book and in the Rankin Bass animated version. I have no excuse for this, except to say that human brains are fallible, and I didn't want to leave it unremarked upon because I know that some of you eagle-eyed viewers and listeners are going to catch that mistake. So, this is my note to say, sorry, I messed up, but I think you'll see that it doesn't really affect the overall point I'm making with this video. So thanks for listening to my little aside, and now, back to the main event. On the car ride to dinner afterwards, Nigel explained to us that he felt the way the story of the One Ring ended was too contrived, that it robbed the protagonists of their agency, that it was, in his words, too deus ex machina. And I said, yes, Nigel, my brother in Eru, that's the point. Divine providence at work in the world of Middle-earth is what the story is all about. The real hero of The Lord of the Rings is not Frodo Baggins, or Aragorn, son of Arathorn, or even our beloved Sam. No, the hero is God. Eru, as God is known in Tolkien's Legendarium, has a divine plan at work the whole time. Every character in the story was a part of that plan, and God's instrument in that plan was Gollum, the lowliest, most decrepit, most despised nobody in all of Middle-earth. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. For many may be called, but few are chosen. Now, of course, that ending bit of flair is a quote from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verse 16. The point I was making was that Gollum, becoming the instrument of the One Ring's destruction seemingly by accident, was intended by Tolkien to illustrate the principle that God works God's will in the world through the least of these. And sometimes the least are so meek, so pitiable, so despised, that they are literally invisible to the wider world. But that does not stop God from noticing them or from making them part of God's plan. And when God does that, most of us are confused by it. Tolkien was a devout Christian, a tradcath, actually. He saw his work as an extension and promotion of his Christian ethos, and I have always felt that whatever one's personal religious beliefs or lack thereof, one cannot really understand the nuances of The Lord of the Rings without engaging sympathetically with that Christian ethos. It is central to what Tolkien was doing, and while authorial intent is never the whole story, it is an important tool in understanding the nature of an author's work. Incidentally, I'm pretty sure that my old friend Nigel would have hated the books for this very reason. Because that feeling of Providence at work, of the main characters getting too lucky a little too often, of an invisible hand of fate moving people and events around in accordance with some predetermined plan, is pervasive in The Lord of the Rings. It is subtle, to be sure, but it is there, from beginning to end. And I thought about this, and about my old buddy Nigel, quite a lot while I was watching The Rings of Power, Season 1, because that ambience of Providence at work in the world of Middle-earth saturates the show at many levels. So much so that a lot of its detractors complained that it often feels like the show's plot is driving character actions rather than the other way around. And for a time, I took that observation to heart as a valid criticism of the show. As much as I love The Rings of Power, it is not perfect, and I felt it was only honest of me to acknowledge the show's flaws in good faith. But then, I started noticing that characters within the narrative were making the same observation, more than once.
He could have landed anywhere and he landed here. I know it sounds strange, but somehow, I just know it's important. It's like there's a reason this happened, like I was supposed to find him. Me.
It was the sea that put her in my path. And the sea is always right.
There's a reason he came to us. I know I'm not special. I know I'm just one little Harfoot in a grand, wide world. But he is special. We can feel it.
Ours was no chance meeting. Not fate, nor destiny, nor any of the words men use to speak of the forces they lack the conviction to name. Ours was the work of something greater. You must see it. There is a tempest in me. It swept me to this island for a reason, and it will not be quelled by you, Regent.
There are powers beyond darkness at work in this world. Perhaps on days such as this, we've little choice but to trust to their designs and surrender our own.
Betimes, our paths are laid before us by powers greater than our own. In those moments, it's our task to make our feet go where our hearts wish not to tread, no matter the perils awaiting us on the way.
So, I couldn't help but think that the plot-driven feel of Season 1 was not a sign of bad writing, but rather a deliberate choice meant to convey exactly the feeling it engendered, and just got widely misunderstood, in some cases, I think, deliberately. The Rings of Power tells us through both its narrative structure and the voices of its characters that there is a force of transcendent good at work in the world, and that we should trust in its plan even if we cannot see it yet. In other words, the Rings of Power is calling us to faith. At least within the context of the show. And once this fell into place for me, I began to notice all the other ways that the show explores and engages with Christian themes, much like Tolkien's original work did. Starting with the most superficial aspects, there is no sex or nudity in the Rings of Power. There's no foul language, next to no gore, and what little gore does exist is used to evoke disgust or horror, not titillation. The heroic protagonists are unironically earnest and pure of heart, though not without flaws they must overcome. There's not a morally gray anti-hero in the whole lot. No, not even Galadriel. And we'll get to that, don't worry. By the way, did I mention that Halbrand is the Antichrist? The tone of Rings of Power is high-minded and reverent rather than grim-dark, and the color palette is vibrant and varied, setting it apart from grittier shows like House of the Dragon or The Witcher. In short, The Rings of Power is a pretty wholesome and family-friendly show. And it takes place in a world where morality is objective and has physical manifestations and is not simply a matter of opinion. Sauron's abandoned fortress in the far north is so suffused with physical evil that fire gives off no heat there. As the orcs spread through the Southlands, evil infects the animals and plants, making them sick and unusable. The woods on the Harfoot's migration path are too bare for that time of year, indicating that rising evil has disrupted the seasonal cycle of the entire world. The blight on the tree at Gil-galad's court in Lindon is the physical manifestation of a lingering and spreading darkness. In the Rings of Power, evil causes creation itself to groan. Meanwhile, the metal ore mithril contains and emanates the sacred, healing light of the Valar themselves. It is a material expression of the objective goodness and holiness of divinity. And Galadriel affirms the inherent sanctity of the physical world in the show's very first line of narration, reminding us that nothing is evil in the beginning, which not only references the Council of Elrond in the novels, but also evokes the biblical principle that everything God has made is good. All of this not only calls back to, but builds upon and expands the theological worldview that Tolkien baked into every word and image in his legendarium. It is well known that Tolkien considered The Lord of the Rings to be an expression of Christian spirituality. In a 1953 letter to Robert Murray, Tolkien wrote, quote, "The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in, or have cut out, practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism." Unquote. What he means there is that for the characters existing inside the world Tolkien crafted, there is no established religion as we understand it, because there doesn't need to be. Because the world itself is their church, and the rhythms of their lives are their liturgies and rituals. This is one reason why poetry and a sense of musicality are so prominent in Middle-earth. Such moments are meant to evoke religious hymns. It's the reason that Tolkien spends long passages of text lingering on the intricate details of objects or places, and why he writes about nature itself with the implication that it is alive in a more than merely biological way. These details are worth paying attention to because they are expressions of the sacredness of creation. There is no need for organized religion in this reality because its denizens sense, bone deep through every breath, that they live in a sacred space, and when they are virtuous, they behave accordingly. And their virtue shapes the world around them. The Rings of Power continues and advances this theme from Tolkien by serving as a meditation on virtue ethics, on how adhering to and modeling traditional Christian virtues can transform systems of power through inspiring, steadfast examples of personal devotion. This theme is carried through the show's multiple narratives by its four central protagonists, Arondir, Elrond, Galadriel, and Nori. Each of these characters represents and enacts one or more of the traditional Christian virtues codified by the medieval Christianity that so enamored Tolkien's imagination. And, in so doing, each of them becomes an instrument for Providence to work its will in the world. In Christian terms, they become vessels of the Holy Spirit. Arondir models fortitude and, to a lesser extent, chastity. Elrond follows the path of prudence. Galadriel acts with zeal, driven by faith, although with a giant asterisk next to her. Again, we'll get to that. And Nori is practically the embodiment of the virtues of charity and kindness. Now you can't see it, but in the script I am reading right now, I have capitalized the names of each of those virtues. That's because I am treating them as proper nouns, the way they appear in the canon of the Christian and particularly the Catholic tradition. The Christian virtues and their corresponding system of ethics are rooted in the Gospel and were codified out of both the Greek and Hebrew traditions. Early church councils and later St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica classified these virtues into different categories, including the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance, and various gifts and fruits of the Holy Spirit, which include but are not limited to gifts like counsel, piety, understanding, and wisdom, and fruits such as patience, kindness, generosity, and self-control. In later centuries, church philosophers would develop a system from all of this called the 7 saintly virtues, which were generosity, humility, meekness, zeal, abstinence, chastity, and patience. The 7 saintly virtues correspond to the 7 deadly sins. Maybe you've heard of them? They were the bad guys in the first Shazam movie? Anyway, these groups of virtues were eventually enshrined into the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, literal centuries worth of philosophy and theory have been written about the Christian virtues, and I am not going to unpack all of that here. Instead, I'll just point out that a consistent theme in Tolkien's stories is the strong personal virtues of his heroes catalyzing triumphs over the powers and principalities of the fallen world around them. These, of course, culminate in Frodo self-sacrificing for the sake of the world, Sam self-sacrificing for the good of Frodo, and the entire Fellowship self-sacrificing for the freedom of Middle-earth. But the real victory was sealed all the way back in The Hobbit when Bilbo took pity on Gollum instead of killing him. This act of mercy, carried forward by Frodo and Sam, leads directly to Gollum falling with the One Ring into the lava of Mount Doom. As Christopher A. Snyder notes in his book Hobbit Virtues, the world was saved because 3 hobbits took pity on a miserable, wretched, murderous creature full of malice and deceit. The little people are lordly, they have grown morally. There is much wisdom and much courage within them, but love and mercy sit above all their many hobbit virtues. Nothing so grand as the destruction of the One Ring has yet happened in the Rings of Power. It's still the beginning of a longer story, after all. But the show does explore a similar theme through the 4 main characters, and each of these characters, by adhering to the virtues they represent, becomes a vessel for Providence to catalyze change in the less virtuous world around them, just as Tolkien's original heroes did. Let's start with Nori Brandyfoot, perhaps the most explicit example. Nori is a Harfoot, one of the 3 clans of little people who will one day be called hobbits. She lives in a nomadic society that gives lip service to the idea of community and mutual aid, but is rather disturbingly and casually cruel in reality. If any member of the tribe finds themselves injured or delayed while on the trail between campsites, they will be left behind to fend for themselves, which is explicitly framed in the show to be a death sentence. Every Harfoot lives in literal mortal terror of falling behind or of being exiled to the back of the procession. Now, many of Rings of Power's detractors have pointed to the cruelty of Harfoot society as a betrayal of Tolkien's vision, without seeming to understand that this world-building choice was made to provide a context in which Nori could model the Christian virtues of charity and kindness. When the stranger first arrives, the Harfoots fear and hate him. Sadok Burrows, the tribe's leader, has his heart hardened against the stranger. For the crime of concealing and helping him, Nori and her family are condemned to take up the rear position on the caravan, a sentence that will almost certainly doom some of them to death, as Nori's father has recently broken his ankle. By the ethical standards of her sinful society, Nori would have been within her rights to abandon the stranger, and is even socially pressured to do so. But Nori holds to her virtue, and at every turn aids the stranger in becoming first a member of her family, and then a member of her tribe. Alone among the Harfoots, Nori lives out the biblical injunction to treat foreigners among us as we would treat our own family. And Nori's virtue works. By season's end, inspired and called to morality by Nori's example, the Harfoot tribe votes to send help to the stranger whom they have just banished. Nori's loyalty to the stranger and to her virtue is supported by the blossoming of their scorched grove, a prophetic sign from the One that Nori was right all along. And Sadok Burrows, whose heart had previously been hardened against the stranger, self-sacrifices to save him in the final episode. All because one foolish Harfoot child held fast to her virtue, and in so doing became a prophetic instrument of Providence among her people. Next up is my boy Arondir, by far my favorite of the new characters. I'm a sucker for all things archery and all things elven, and as I pointed out in my introduction video, this moment right here proved that Arondir is one of the elfiest elves who ever elfed. But his skill with a bow is not what makes Arondir a compelling character to me and many other fans. It's his stoic courage and steadfast loyalty to the good, even in the face of certain death. Arondir is a traditional masculine hero cut from the same strong, silent cloth as Aragorn or Legolas. He embodies the saintly virtue of fortitude, defined in the Catholic Catechism as the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of the good. It strengthens the resolve to resist temptations and to overcome obstacles in the moral life. The virtue of fortitude enables one to conquer fear, even fear of death, and to face trials and persecutions. It disposes one even to renounce and sacrifice his life in defense of a just cause. Arondir's quiet confidence and faith in the good never wavers, even in the face of what he must believe is certain death. He lends his strength to Bronwyn, quietly and unfussily enabling her to become the leader her people need. He organizes the defense of her Southland village and gives a rousing speech to inspire self-confidence in these simple people as they prepare to face down Adar's orcish army. Even as Adar's forces decisively conquer the village and have everyone trapped in the tavern, executing them one by one, Arondir does not break. He holds true to what he knows is good, and like Nori, his virtue pays off with a dramatic moment of divine intervention. The Númenórean expeditionary force led by Galadriel and Queen Regent Miriel arrives just in the nick of time, delivering them all from an undoubtedly gruesome fate. Speaking of Galadriel, we'll get to that in a minute. Also, Halbrand is the Antichrist. Let's first look at Elrond, our paragon of prudence. As a character transported into the show from Tolkien's original legendarium, there's a lot of foreshadowing built into Robert Aramayo's subtle but engaging performance. We can see many hints of the discerning and courageous elf lord who will not only be on the front lines during the War of the Last Alliance, facing Sauron alongside Isildur, but also, thousands of years later, will play a crucial diplomatic role in the formation of the Fellowship who ultimately defeat the Dark Lord. I really love Aramayo's take on a young Elrond, especially in his interactions with Prince Durin and Princess Disa. There's so much love and charm built into these performances that even all but the most cynical of the show's detractors have conceded that it's arguably the best part of the Rings of Power. And that's due, in no small part, to the way the show uses Elrond to model the virtue of prudence. The Catholic Catechism defines prudence as, quote, the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. It is not to be confused with timidity or fear, nor with duplicity or dissimulation. It is called the charioteer of the virtues. It guides the other virtues by setting rules and measures. It is prudence that immediately guides the judgment of conscience. The prudent man determines and directs his conduct in accordance with his judgment. With the help of this virtue, we apply moral principles to particular cases without error and overcome doubts about the good to achieve and the evil to avoid. Elrond's commitment to prudence finds him trapped by divided loyalties. On the one hand, he has a duty to his king and his people to obtain the help of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm in the building of Celebrimbor's great forge. On the other hand, his loyalty to his friend Prince Durin leads him to swear an oath of secrecy on his friend's behalf about the existence of the mithril veins. Elrond navigates a world of lies and shadows by always seeking to do the good in every particular situation, ferreting out the truth along the way. In the end, his discernment leads him to choose loyalty to his friend over duty to his king, an act that exposes the king's true motives and ultimately leads him to remember his own virtue. When Elrond later reminds Gil-galad that hope, one of the Christian virtues, is never mere, even when it is meager, the king is moved to approve Celebrimbor's final project. Ultimately, this leads to the forging of the 3 elven rings of power, an act that, yes, serves Sauron's plans, but serves Eru Ilúvatar's plans even more. Sauron plays a long game, but Eru plays an even longer one, and as we know from the Lord of the Rings' treatment of the idea of Providence at work, the crafting of the rings is a part of that plan. By this point in the season's final episode, even Galadriel has begun to have real faith and accept her role in that divine plan. Which brings us to the part all of you really want to complain about: Galadriel's supposedly bad writing. I have a whole video on the way that explores the Rings of Power's handling of Galadriel in relation to Tolkien's Legendarium, so I'll just say this for right now. It truly baffles me that so many detractors of this show based their intense dislike of it on the assumption that they were supposed to like the version of Galadriel they meet in Season 1. All of them seem to think that the show failed at making them like her, and never stop to consider that maybe the show wasn't actually asking that of them. Rings of Power gives Galadriel a common and quickly understood motivation that most people can easily see turning into an obsession. The show does want us to sympathize with her, and your mileage may vary on that, fair enough. But sympathizing with someone and liking them are different things. You are supposed to be frustrated by this version of Galadriel when you meet her. If you think the Rings of Power's goal was to present Galadriel as an inspirational, stunning and brave girl boss, then you have not understood what this show is doing. At all. Galadriel is the only one of the 4 main protagonists who has a clearly discernible character arc. The other 3 remain more or less the same people throughout the season and serve mostly as catalysts to provoke virtuous action in the world and characters around them. Galadriel fills that role too. Her zeal, backed up by prophetic signs, calls Queen Miriel and Elendil back to their faith, even in the face of great personal loss.
My father once told me that the way of the faithful is committing to pay the price, even if the cost cannot be known, and trusting that in the end it will be worth it.
Sometimes the cost is dear.
It is.
We have little choice then but to keep serving. And I, for one, will see to it that we make the end worth the price.
Come what may.
Come what may.
But she also returns to true faith herself, a faith she didn't even realize had died within her. Galadriel begins Rings of Power lost, clinging to a memory of faith in the providence of the Valar, but mistaking her wrath for their will. And, well, that doesn't really work out so well for her. In fact, it literally blows up in her face.
Sauron lives because of you!
For most of Season 1, Galadriel is an avatar of the virtue of zeal, or persistence, rushing headlong into every challenge and refusing to consider any vision other than her own. But her virtue has been tainted by the shadow and has become the vices of pride and wrath. Not until after all her plans blow up in her face does Galadriel begin to question her own vision. First, she realizes she has been losing her own internal war against darkness.
I would not use such words.
Why not?
It darkens the heart to call dark deeds good. It gives place for evil to thrive inside us. Every war is fought both without and within. Of that every soldier must be mindful.
In her dialogues with Theo after the first eruption of Mount Doom, Galadriel is not simply giving advice to the young man she's rescued. She's also speaking to herself, externalizing her inner conflict for the audience to hear. She's been confronted by Adar, a dark mirror of her own ambition, and lured the Númenórean armies into ruin, playing right into the Shadow's hands. And now, her conscience is awakening because of her folly. Galadriel blames herself for the catastrophe of Mordor's creation and takes her first steps on the road back to redemption. In other modern fantasy shows, this turn would be the point where a protagonist doubles down on the strength of their own resolve and vows to become stronger. But Galadriel takes a much different tack. Instead of boosting her own ego, she surrenders to the will of Providence.
There are powers beyond darkness at work in this world. Perhaps on days such as this, we've little choice but to trust to their designs and surrender our own.
And this return to faith gives her the gift of discernment, finally enabling her to penetrate Halbrand's deceptions and realize that he is Sauron, and to realize how deeply blinded she had been by her own fanaticism, so blind that she failed to see the enemy she sought had been right in front of her the whole time. Galadriel's return to faith also gives her the strength to resist Sauron's temptation of temporal power in the season finale, a scene that mirrors Satan's temptation of Christ with temporal power in the Gospels. See, for example, Matthew 4:1-11 and Luke 4:1-13. And by season's end, Galadriel is willing to give up not only her sword, as Elrond had urged her to do in Episode 1, but also her brother's dagger, a token that had fettered her to the sin of wrath for centuries. As the dagger melts in the fires of Celebrimbor's great forge, destined to become part of the Elven Rings of Power, Galadriel reaches a turning point in her journey. Not an end, not the beginning of an end, but the end of a beginning. The beginning of a transformation from the frustrating avatar of wrath we meet in Season 1 into the ethereal angel of composure and wisdom we will meet in the Third Age. The way the Rings of Power uses Galadriel and the other four protagonists as agents of Christian virtue in a fallen world where evil moves like a thief in the night is one of the main ways it engages with Tolkien's own religious themes. It's one of the chief reasons I personally love the show, and I'm hoping we'll see more of this in future seasons. If the showrunners keep leaning into these elements, I suspect that Rings of Power will turn out to be a much bigger gift to Middle-earth fans than it's already been. But I want to hear what you think. Sound off in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. That really helps the channel and it helps this video's chances in the algorithm. If you hated every word of this, go ahead and give me a thumbs down. That'll really show me. Thanks for watching in either case, and until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the wait, hold on, I almost forgot. Did I mention that Halbrand is the Antichrist? Look, he's framed as an edgier Aragorn, a sort of anti-Aragorn, if you will, and Aragorn was one of Tolkien's Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings. Halbrand is mistaken for a great savior who was promised and prayed for. He deceives the powers and prophets of his day so he can rise to power. He even has 3 magi from the east who followed a star to the west looking for him. You do the math. Shanti, Salam, Shalom.